Reprise du débat,
Resuming debate.
for Ottawa South.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise today to speak to this bill, Bill C-3. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-3 is the follow-up bill to Bill C-57 from the last session of this House, which was in part not passed by now, of course, because the House was prorogued for a unusually long period of time. It's unfortunate because I think that we would have dispatched with this legislation much more efficiently had we been sitting here. And in many respects, what we're seeing in this bill is the kind of a piecemeal, what I might even describe as an incoherent approach to transportation safety policy in Canada, where small things are being released, sort of trickling out in dribs and drabs, Mr. Speaker, without, at least at this point, not yet, without seeing a comprehensive approach to transportation safety in the country to deal with the important issues that have been raised by many speakers around marine transportation, rail transportation, passenger safety, and beyond, of course. This bill is mostly about technical amendments, and for that, the Liberal Party of Canada will be supporting sending this bill to committee. It's got different parts to it, of course. Part one, enacting the Aviation Industry Indemnity Act, which allows aviation participants in the event of loss or damage to deal with what are called war risks. This, of course, flows from the attacks in the United States on 11th of September 2001, when insurance companies stopped offering air carriers liability insurance for what are typically called war risks. So there's part one of the bill. It I think can be dealt with. I'm looking forward to hearing more about it at committee. Part two amends the Aeronautics Act to establish a new procedure for investigating accidents or incidents involving civilians in a military aircraft. Again, clauses 10 and 26, I'm looking forward to seeing more evidence to substantiate the new process in the Aeronautics Act that will allow for investigations of accidents that involve a civilian at a military aircraft or installation. That will be important to go through. Part three amends the Canada Marine Act in relation to the effective date of the appointment of a director of a port authority, more or less standard fare, very much housekeeping, Mr. Speaker. Part four amends the Marine Liability Act to implement the International Convention on Liability and Compensation for Damage in connection with the carriage of hazardous and noxious substances by sea. This effectively provides for the liability of ship owners and operators for damage caused by pollutants, and in particular, it finally implements in Canada the liability scheme established pretty much elsewhere internationally by the several international conventions that are already in place. So we're making progress, I think, Mr. Speaker, in terms of these small amendments, and finally, Part 5 amends the Canada Shipping Act to introduce new requirements for operators of oil handling facilities. Ostensibly, the government says to help produce a world-class tanker safety system. Can't help but be struck, Mr. Speaker, by a world-class tanker safety system when the government rushed through licenses in the Beaufort Sea without full knowledge that there is no technology to deal with a potential spill, should there be one, in that most fragile of Canadian seas. Now, let us turn, Mr. Speaker, to the overall context within which I think this bill has been presented and what's happening out there amongst Canadians.
First of all, we had the McGuinty's tragedy that affected the whole country. Of course, the people in Quebec and in the Lac-Mégantic region, the families were particularly affected by it. And it is something that has stayed in the memories of Canadians and deeply troubled us.
Here in the city of Ottawa, we had a derailment in Calgary, which the Mayor Nenshi, spoke of just some time ago. And of course, we had the derailment over the weekend in Gainford, Alberta, and so many more instances of rail safety questions. This is also taking place. This bill is being deposited at a time when we are debating pipelines. We're debating pipelines heading west, the Gateway Pipeline. We're debating pipelines heading south, the Keystone Pipeline, and of course, the question of Line 9, reversing the flow of a pipeline between Sarnia and Montreal in order to provide more feedstock for Eastern Canadian refineries. I would pause for a moment and say that I think that the government has seriously compromised Canada's reputation with respect to its dealings with the Keystone Pipeline, and in fact weakened us. And for that matter, to a certain extent, I think even weakened the Democratic presidency of President Obama by not actually working with American congressional leaders and the President's office to actually be able to show that Canada was serious about climate change. And because we've been delaying, we have been denying, we have been dragging our feet, we've been making up stories, we've been hitching our wagon, once to President Obama, and at some other point we hitched to somebody else or some other phenomena or factor. Because of this, of course, Canada is now very much behind the 8 ball, and when it comes at least to Washington, but I can certainly confirm from international experience elsewhere, Canada is now very much considered to be a pariah on the climate change file, not moving forward. And in a sense, I think this is how the Prime Minister has seriously compromised our reputation in Washington, and I think put the Keystone Pipeline very much at risk. So, as I said, I think Canadians are very concerned about a few things. They see these instances on television, they read about them in the newspapers. They're very concerned about passenger safety. They're very concerned about community safety, marine safety, of course. They're concerned about the transport of dangerous substances, what's happening in their local municipalities with trains running in and out. And they're very concerned about environmental protection. One of the least well-known fallout effects of the Lac Mégantic tragedy, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that it's going to take decades and probably hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to clean up the affected watershed that's in play in that region, something that we've let slip to a certain extent in coverage, I think, outside of Quebec. Mr. Speaker, another factor at play, of course, is that there's a trend towards moving more and more oil in Canada on rail. I think this is really worthy of exploring for Canadians to understand what's happening. There are really important fundamental questions about our aging Canadian rail infrastructure. There are important questions that are being raised about the type of rail cars that are being used and have been used both in Canada and the United States for decades, and their safety, engineering standards, for example. So why is there such a trend towards moving more and more oil in Canada on rail? Well, the first reason, Mr. Speaker, is because North American oil production is outpacing pipeline capacity. For example, rail shipments of oil to our coastal refineries or to our export centers have gone from about 6,000 train carloads in 2009 to almost 14,000 carloads this year. That is a massive and significant increase in moving oil by rail. And we've seen a concomitant investment by the railway companies in new cars, new capacity to carry more oil, of course, because they want an ever-increasing share of that market opportunity, as one would expect from a private company. The second reason why, of course, we're seeing more oil carried by rail is because, as I mentioned, railways want to increase their market share. And they've seized upon an opportunity here because the oil by rail as a substitute idea is being encouraged by the Conservatives as a way, Mr. Speaker, to circumvent the approval processes, which they often have been weakening or undermining, whether it's the NEB, whether it's environmental assessment. We know that's the case. We've seen it. It's been happening now for years. And or they're trying in certain quarters to circumvent strong or ferocious opposition to different ideas that are being put forward by industrial proponents. So that is having another effect, another force at play on driving oil onto our railways. Third factor, there is enormous pressure on our infrastructure. I alluded to this, both rail and pipeline. Even if all current pipeline projects are approved in Canada, oil production will exceed pipeline capacity by 1 million barrels a day by 2025. That's in 12 short years. We will exceed our pipeline capacity by 1 million barrels a day. Now, the first thing I thought of when I came face to face with the statistic, Mr. Speaker, was to reflect on the words of the former Premier of Alberta, Peter Lougheed, who asked some very probative and profound questions about the pace of development in our oil sands, whether or not we were having an adult conversation about that pace, whether the effects in the immediate areas were going to be properly mitigated, and so on and so forth. So we see that there is a massive push and rush to increase capacity in terms of oil production, but not the infrastructure to deal with it. You know, on that note, pressure on rail, of course, is coming from a planned doubling of oil sands exploitation, a doubling of oil sands exploitation over the next decade or so, and also from the 10 to 12 year lifespan of the very, very huge, Mr. Speaker, Bakken shale gas formation in both North Dakota and Montana. And there we're seeing an oil and gas field which is presently producing some 700,000 barrels of oil a day. Now, the estimates are that that's going to last for 10 to 12 years, with production rising from 700,000 to 1 million barrels a day. And interestingly, Mr. Speaker, the light crude on board the main Montreal and Atlantic Railway, which exploded in Lac Mégantic, came from this area, the Bakken Shale gas formation, en route to an Irving oil refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. So Bakken as a project apparently does not lend itself, say the energy economists, to a pipeline because it isn't economic. It takes some 50 years for a pipeline to be adjudged to be economic, to pay for itself. And this, as I mentioned, has a 10 to 12 year remaining shelf life in terms of exploitation of the gas and oil in that particular reserve. Another important question, Mr. Speaker, at play in context as this bill is brought to the floor is the following. There are some very, very serious and legitimate questions being raised with respect to the enforcement of railway safety by Transport Canada. And nowhere is this more evident than in the safety management systems, the SMSs as they're referred to, which rail companies are required to produce and abide by. For that matter, so are different companies involved and regulated by Transport Canada. They also have safety management systems, airlines, for example. However, these safety management systems are not public. They are not rendered public. They're not made available, not disclosed for interested parties, stakeholders, flying passengers, company executives, folks who work on railways, people who are in the business of insuring railways and the shipment of these risky products. These safety management systems aren't disclosed. I think we can do a lot better than that, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the probity and the transparency I think that Canadians are asking for and I think deserve going forward. Transport Canada, once these safety management systems are put in place, then performs audits of the company's SMS. But these audits with railways and, for example, the same thing applies with pipeline companies, there is no requirement for an explicit, what we might call safety culture assessment. So an auditor can go in and audit against a document and spot check. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is an explicit requirement for the auditors and the inspectors to sit down with senior managers, interview employees, deal with suppliers, talk to other regulators at the provincial level, for example, for railways that don't cross provincial boundaries, and so on and so forth. So we can do a lot better, I think, with respect to these safety management systems and making them more transparent. And transparency, shining the light of day on these management systems, I think would help improve them. I've also heard from a number of inspectors, Mr. Speaker, who are retired from Transport Canada or presently working within Transport Canada, that they are deeply, deeply concerned about the capacity of Transport Canada to perform these audits of safety management systems on a number of fronts, whether it is marine shipping, whether it is airlines, whether it is railways, and beyond. There are very, very troubling questions being raised by these inspectors who are good people, good faith, goodwill, go to work every day, try to do their jobs, but are now feeling the pinch as they try to cover so many different regulated companies and haven't got the capacity to do so. That's something I think we're going to have to explore in a much more meaningful way, Mr. Speaker, at committee in due course, whether it is with respect to this bill or whether it's respect to the promised deep railway safety study that the committee is supposed to undertake this fall in the wake of early findings from the Transportation Safety Board in terms of its learnings derived from the tragedy at Lac-Mégantic. In some respects, Mr. Speaker, shifting gears a little bit, this bill addresses the liability question, but only tangentially, as I mentioned earlier. But there are lingering questions. Most Canadians, once they are over the shock of something as dramatic as a bus in this city here in my backyard, just outside my riding, colliding with a train, or where citizens are killed, or whether 47 of their fellow citizens who died in Lac-Mégantic, then questions around who is responsible come to the fore. And I think here, this is where, as parliamentarians, we're going to have to examine very carefully the whole question of liability. Who is responsible for the liability, the costs? Who is responsible for indemnifying, for example, the town of Lac-Mégantic? Who is responsible for helping the families of the victims, those who may be disabled in an accident, those who feel the effects, on their human health, perhaps? Who's responsible with respect to spills at sea? Who's responsible for spills on land? The environmental cleanup costs. I alluded to that earlier with respect to Lac-Mégantic. We've seen what's happened with a major spill in the Kalamazoo River in the state of Michigan in the United States. We've seen what the National Transportation Safety Board has said about that in the United States, which, in parenthesis, Mr. Speaker, concerns me because that NTSB evidence is not being heard at the National Energy Board in Canada, as Enbridge's applications for different kinds of pipeline projects. I believe that we should be examining global practice. What has happened in one jurisdiction, I think, is something we should be learning from in this jurisdiction, and vice versa. When our Canadian Transportation Safety Board issues a report eventually, finally, on Lac-Mégantic and that terrible tragedy, I think there will be many, many findings that are capable of being extrapolated in other countries, other locations. I don't know why the Conservatives have closed and narrowed the evidentiary acceptability gap, if I can call it, at the National Energy Board to the point where the findings of the NTSB in Washington are not being factored into applications being made by a proponent in Canada. It just makes no sense. Most corporations today, as they work hard to earn their social license, want to be able to have a global code of practice, a standard of practice, and drive it up everywhere together roughly at the same time, the same way. So I think we have a lot of questions with respect to who is responsible, who is liable. For example, I've had a constituent write to me, Mr. Speaker, recently and ask, well, okay, shouldn't liability extend here to the company that was actually importing the oil? In this case, is the Irving Oil refinery responsible in part? Should they have some fiduciary responsibility? That's an important question for us to examine. So, Mr. Speaker, we need a comprehensive approach going forward. I think there's a wonderful opportunity for parliamentarians to get it better for Canadians. There's fear in Canadian society. I think we have an obligation to assuage that fear by doing good and better work. I am concerned, the Auditor General concluded in a report in 2011, let me quote, Transport Canada has not designed and implemented the management practices needed to effectively monitor regulatory compliance, close quote, with respect to the transportation of dangerous goods as set out by the Department. So, Mr. Speaker, we can do better than that. We owe it to Canadians, we owe it to citizens, we owe it to our companies, we owe it to shippers, we owe it to all the folks out there with good faith and goodwill who want to make sure that we actually do better and do right by Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaires. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.